Hello everyone and welcome to this weekly lecture. Our learning objectives are to explain the political philosophies of the framers of the U.S. Constitution, including the fundamental ideas of the Declaration of Independence, the federalism, anti-federalism debate, ideas about representative democracy, checks and balances, and the foundations of the Bill of Rights and a limited constitution. So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome back to the weekly lecture on the U.S. Constitution. We're going to pick up where we left off last week. We talked about colonial origins, ending with the Declaration of Independence. About a year after the Declaration was drafted, the Continental Congress adopted a document called the Articles of Confederation. And this is considered the first written constitution of the United States. It's in effect from 1777 to 1789. It was ratified by all states in 1781, and it creates something known as a confederation, in which the state governments retain sovereignty, freedom, and independence. So essentially, the central government and the states have equal power. And this is going to be a problem because it creates a weak central government. There's no executive branch with a president. We have only a legislature, and even that legislature has limited powers. It leads to impractical government, where each state has one vote regardless of population. That's fine with the small states because it kind of gives them disproportionate power, but then the bigger states feel like now they have proportionately less power, so they're resentful. It also requires all 13 states to agree to make amendments, which is pretty much impossible. It also lacks a national army and navy to protect Americans, and the national government had no taxing authority, which is going to be a problem because the country had quite a lot of debt after the American Revolution. And pretty soon what ends up happening is there's economic calamity, basically, because everybody was in debt. All the states were in debt, the central government was in debt, farmers were also in debt. And so what ended up happening is that the individual states began clamping down on people who are in debt, and the banks begin repossessing debt-ridden lands, mostly held by poor farmers in western Massachusetts. And this leads to a rebellion known as Shays' Rebellion in 1787. The rebellion is going to fail, but the fact that these farmers have risen up and they're challenging local federal authority reveals the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. And so along with Shays' Rebellion and the general economic decline that's happening as the states basically go to war economically with each other, it reveals that under the Articles of Confederation, Congress had not been able to act decisively in a moment of crisis. And this is jeopardizing the whole country just a few years after the end of the Revolution. And so this leads to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. And there are a couple of things that are in play here. First of all, there's the economic side of it. The people who are attending the convention, supporting the convention, are seeking to create a new government that will promote commerce and protect property. And then there are also the political principles, which is to come up with some type of change to the Articles that's going to embody political theories regarding liberty, equality, and democracy, and maintain some type of balance between the central government and the states. Now, some of these people who are attending the convention as delegates think that they're just going to amend the Articles. There's a bit of secrecy involved. People like Madison, Hamilton, Washington know that when they get to the convention that they're going to try to scrap the Articles and come up with a brand new document instead. But that was something that was actually kept secret because they were worried that if they let that cat out of the bag, a lot of people wouldn't support that and wouldn't even come. They figured once they get people in Philadelphia and people like Madison and Hamilton can convince them on the spot, people like Franklin, Washington, people who had a lot of legitimacy because of their role in the revolution, they thought these people could then convince the potential critics or opponents to stay there. And for the most part, that is what happened, although about 15 of these delegates are actually going to leave because they get to the point where they don't like the way that the convention is heading, and they won't be among the final delegates to vote on uh, approving the final document. But for the most part, the plan does seem to work. And so the goals of the framers of the Constitution are: create a central government strong enough to promote commerce and protect property, prevent excessive democracy. If you recall from week 1 in the reading about representative democracy, a lot of these framers are suspicious of letting too many people vote. They think that will lead to mob rule. An emphasis on ideas that would generate public support, restraint of the federal government from impinging on liberties, a bicameral legislature, and somehow resolving the issue of slavery. And as we'll see, essentially, they resolve to kind of ignore it and let it continue. One of the main issues to solve was how they would divvy up power between the larger states and the smaller states. That was an issue of representation because under the Articles, each state essentially got one seat, one vote. But these larger states really wanted something that was going to represent their larger proportion. And so there were a couple of plans with how to handle this. First of all, the Virginia plan called for a system of representation based on the state population or proportion of each state's revenue contribution to the national government, or both. And the smaller states don't like this because they feel like this is clearly biased in favor of the large states. And it's calling for a bicameral legislature where both houses are going to be proportionate to either a larger state's population or proportion of its revenue. That would totally put the smaller states in a position of having less power. And then the New Jersey plan was kind of a response from the smaller states, which would basically keep things the way they are, with all the states having equal representation, which would disproportionately give the smaller states more power because it would put them on a level playing field with the bigger states. But thus also it would diminish the power of the bigger states, and the bigger states didn't like that. So what to do? And it comes down to a compromise in which they take a little bit of each plan and create the Great Compromise, which is also known as the Connecticut Compromise because the Connecticut delegates are the ones who propose this. And so the Great Compromise creates a bicameral legislature, meaning that there are two houses within the legislature. And so what that does is it creates one chamber known as the House of Representatives, in which representatives will be apportioned, meaning divvied out by population in each state. So it's taking that aspect of the Virginia plan. And then in the U.S. Senate, we will have equal representation regardless of population, taking that from the New Jersey plan. The Great Compromise would create the national legislative branch, a bicameral Congress consisting of two chambers set forth in Article 1 of the Constitution. The two chambers would consist of the House of Representatives and the Senate. There would be differences between these two chambers. Members would serve 2-year terms in the House, and members would serve 6 years in the Senate. The Senate was designed to guard against excessive democracy, meaning that the members were not directly elected. They would be appointed by state legislatures. The Senate alone was given the power to ratify treaties and approve presidential appointments to the executive branch and also to the judicial branch. And the House was given the sole power to originate revenue bills, meaning bills to raise or lower taxes. But there was one issue that still needed to be resolved, and that was the issue of slavery. The Constitution essentially was a compromise between the slaveholding states and the non-slaveholding states. And just like the Great Compromise was about resolving representation, there needed to be some type of agreement over how enslaved people would be counted for representation. And so there's this disagreement in which the South wants to count every single enslaved person because that would boost their population numbers, give them more representatives in the House. And then members of the convention from the North wanted to not count enslaved people. And so this compromise is the 3/5 compromise that they come to, in which seats would be apportioned by population, in which enslaved people counted as 3/5 of a person. And looking back on it, this obviously seems like a very cynical type of arrangement to make in which enslaved people are not even being counted as a full person. And this reflects kind of the larger question about whether the Constitution does support the institution of slavery. And as one of your weekly readings will suggest, the evidence is that it did. For instance, Article 4, Section 2, Clause 3 was a fugitive slave clause that was meant to require the extradition of enslaved people from non-slaveholding states back to slaveholding states. There was a prohibition on any kind of ban on the African slave trade before 1808. A lot of people interpret that clause to essentially require Congress to ban the African slave trade. In 1808, it did not. It just prevented Congress from doing anything about it before 1808. And then Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4 prohibited certain taxes, and this was seen as prohibiting any effort by the federal government to undermine slavery through taxation by applying taxes on enslaved people. So in taking the 3/5 compromise and then multiple other clauses that protected slavery, there seems to be enough evidence suggesting that the Constitution, at the very least, allowed slavery to continue and could be interpreted as allowing it to grow, which it did. In the next 70 years, slavery expanded quite drastically, especially with innovations in the production of cotton. And so here we have the question of, did the Constitution protect what's known as slave power? And slave power was the political influence of Southern slaveholders. There's two ways of looking at this. If we look at letters from certain founders, like Madison, for instance, who is the chief architect of the Constitution, he took notes throughout the Constitutional Convention, and these notes are one of the main sources that we get for taking account of what happened throughout this event. And Madison, in his notes, seems to downplay support for slavery. A lot of the founders at the time suggested that they supported emancipation, but they always had an excuse for why it wasn't possible. And if we look at this from a contextual standpoint, Southern slaveholders were influenced by many factors. In the lead up to the Revolution and during the Revolution, slaveholding patriots were very sensitive to charges of hypocrisy, which they did receive because if you remember your American history, one of the things that the American patriots will say is that King George III is treating them like slaves. And in England, there was, kind of like, laughter in response because they basically said, "Are you kidding me? How can you say this when you are actual slaveholders?" And so the people like Jefferson and Washington and Madison tried to cover themselves by saying, "Oh, well, we want to get rid of it, but we just haven't figured out how." Which, if you see then what happens after the revolution, in which they don't do anything to try to end it, it seems as though that they're saying this because they're protective of their legacy. They realize that they're going through this momentous event where they're creating a new country. They're invoking values such as freedom and liberty while they themselves are denying other people liberty. And they were very much aware of that. They were definitely aware of the contradiction, and they tried to both cover themselves and in some ways also ignore it in some sense. Another thing that happened was there were some events that seemed to suggest that the English might try to abolish the slave trade. There had been a court case in 1772 known as the Somerset case, in which a British court ruled that slavery was not permitted on British soil, meaning back in England. And so a lot of slaveholders were freaked out by that. And then in 1775, the British governor of Virginia, in an attempt to try to undermine the Patriot cause, offers freedom to enslaved men in exchange for joining the British Army. And there's some historical analysis of this that's suggesting that it's what tips Jefferson and Washington and Madison and a lot of Virginians into war mode, so to speak. They did have other issues that pushed them to consider joining the Patriot cause, but this seems to be at least somewhat involved in their decision making. And for the longest time, historians have tried to debate whether the Constitution did protect slave power. If we take everything within context, if we look at some of their private letters, for instance, after the Revolution, in his private letters, Jefferson urges his friends to expand their slaveholding because he tells them it's very profitable. His letters also suggest that he encouraged brutality against the enslaved people at Monticello. And now with the development of the cotton gin, suddenly producing cotton can become very profitable, and all of a sudden they stop talking about any type of ending of slavery in the South, and in fact they begin expanding it. And the other thing is that oftentimes people have said, well, you know what, look at this, the Virginians were actually trying to end the African slave trade, as you'll read in the weekly assigned reading. But again, within context, the Virginians would have been against the African slave trade because they were the ones who ran the domestic slave trade. So the African slave trade was actually competition for them. And so if we take it within context, we look at what actually happened after the ratification of the Constitution. We look really at what the founders were saying in their own private letters, their actions. It seems as though the Constitution definitely allowed slavery to expand and continue, and the founders in their private actions seem to play a big role in that. Let's take a look at which of the states benefited the most from some of these significant compromises. Remember, representation was one of the biggest issues at the Constitutional Convention. And so when it comes to the House of Representatives, the states with the largest populations ended up getting the most seats, and that would have been states like Virginia or Pennsylvania that had the largest populations. But overall, if we're thinking proportionately, as far as which states really kind of punched above their weight based on their population, a state like Rhode Island that was really small, or Delaware that's really small, is getting 2 seats in the Senate, and yes, they're only getting 1 seat in the House of Representatives, but really this is maximizing their small population to the fullest by getting the 2 seats in the Senate. And so if you're really looking at which of the states are kind of proportionally benefiting the most, it would be a state like Rhode Island. Let's take a quick moment to compare the Articles of Confederation with the Constitution. So first of all, the Articles of Confederation did not provide for an executive branch, whereas the Constitution did, and it created the position of president to oversee the executive branch. Under the Articles of Confederation, there was no federal court system. It only existed at the state level. Under the Constitution, there was a federal judiciary headed by a Supreme Court, along with state courts at the state level. Under the Articles, there was a unicameral legislature with equal representation for each state, meaning there was no House of Representative and Senate. There was just the Continental Congress. Delegates to the Congress of the Confederation were appointed by the states. Under the Constitution, there was a bicameral legislature consisting of Senate and House of Representatives. Each state was represented by 2 senators, while apportionment in the House is based on each state's population. Remember, that was the Great Compromise that set that up. Senators were chosen by the state legislatures, which will later get changed to a direct popular vote in 1913. Members of the Senate had 6-year terms, and members of the House were elected by popular vote for 2-year terms. With the fiscal and economic powers, you can see how under the Articles on the left, the national government was dependent upon the states to collect taxes. The states could coin their own money and print paper money, which is pretty crazy if you think about it. Imagine if today California had its own California currency, and then you had to change it into something else when you crossed the state line into Nevada or Oregon or wherever. It would be kind of chaotic. Under the Articles, the states were free to sign commercial treaties with foreign governments. Again, that created just an entire mess of a situation. So under the Constitution, over here on the right, for fiscal and economic powers, only Congress had the power to levy taxes, coin money, and regulate international and interstate commerce. And states could not coin money or enter into treaties with other nations. Under the Articles of Confederation for the military, the national government was dependent upon state militias and could not form an army during peacetime. On the right, the Constitution enabled the national government to maintain a standing army and navy. Legal supremacy under the Articles, remember it was a confederation. State constitutions and state law were supreme, and the weak central government could not override them. But under the Constitution, the national constitution and the national law was supreme. And then to amend the respective documents, the articles had to be changed by unanimous vote by all states, but under the Constitution, it can be amended by 3/4 of the states. One of the most important aspects of the Constitution is its focus on limiting the power of government, and it does this through a few different ways. One, by the separation of powers. The Constitution created 3 different branches of government, along with checks and balances to prevent any one of those branches from becoming more powerful than the others. Also, it contained the idea of divided constituencies, that office holders were accountable to different elements of the public, and federalism, in which the national government shares power with the states, and eventually it would also include a Bill of Rights, in which citizens would be guaranteed a list of rights. The diagram on this slide shows how checks and balances work to keep the 3 separate branches of government from overpowering one another. For instance, if you look up at the top and over to the right, checks that the legislative branch has over the judicial branch include Congress can change the size of the federal court system and the number of Supreme Court justices. Congress can propose constitutional amendments. It can reject Supreme Court nominees, and it can impeach and remove federal judges. But at the same time, if you look down at the judicial branch, the arrow pointing up to the legislative branch shows the checks that the judicial branch has over the legislative, including the court system can declare congressional laws unconstitutional, and the Chief Justice presides over the Senate during hearing to impeach the president. At the same time that the Constitution limits the power of government, it also gives it new and specific types of powers. For instance, expressed powers, also known as enumerated powers, are specific powers granted by the Constitution to Congress and the President, and then also implied powers, which are created by the necessary and proper clause, and they provide Congress with the authority to make all laws that are necessary and proper to carry out its enumerated powers. So for instance, one of the enumerated powers or expressed powers that Congress has is the right to regulate interstate commerce. Part of interstate commerce today in the 21st century includes the internet. Well, the internet didn't exist back at the time of the Constitutional Convention. And so in order to make sure that Congress has the power to regulate something that crosses state lines through the internet, the power to do that and create something like the Federal Communications Commission, which would have the power to regulate the internet, that power would come from the necessary and proper clause. The power to regulate the internet, in other words, is not an expressed power, but the right to regulate interstate commerce is, and thus the right to regulate something that would fall under interstate commerce, that maybe didn't exist at the time, could be invoked by the necessary and proper clause powers, which are implied, meaning they're not expressly listed. So if we had to summarize the Constitution's impact on government, we could say that it established a blueprint through 6 principles of government. 1, popular sovereignty, the idea that people would have the right to choose their government. Limited government, limiting powers of the government. Separation of powers, meaning creating 3 separate branches of government. Checks and balances to prevent those different branches from becoming too powerful. The concept of judicial review, which was the idea that the court system could overrule something that either the executive or the legislative branch did if it was not constitutional. And then federalism, the system of one national government and many state governments that were separate, but in which the national government would have more power and be supreme. On the other hand, the Anti-Federalists believed in a weaker central government. They liked the Confederation that had existed under the Articles of Confederation. They were mostly rural farmers, small shopkeepers, but also some state government leaders, many slaveholders, people like Thomas Jefferson, who probably couldn't be counted as an actual anti-federalist because for much of this time he was in France. But prominent anti-federalists would have included Patrick Henry, George Clinton, George Mason, James Monroe, and they wanted a Bill of Rights at the bare minimum to guarantee civil liberties, or they were not going to support ratification of the Constitution. One of the most significant outcomes of the battle between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists was that each side published newspaper essays to gain support, but the essays that ended up being the most memorable were the Federalist Papers, which were published anonymously by Hamilton, Jay, and Madison. There were 85 of them, and they defended principles in the Constitution. And we kind of see them today as like a blueprint for how to interpret and use the Constitution. It's almost like a manual to go along with the Constitution. One of the more famous Federalist essays was Federalist Number 10, which explained the way that the framers were hoping that political pluralism would function, meaning the idea that there would be many interests competing. And one of the arguments at the time was, well, what happens if political parties emerge? Are political parties bad for democracy? Are they going to try to take over the system? And Madison's response was that the idea of factions, meaning these different interests, is actually good, and we want to allow as many people to compete in the system because that will maintain the democratic system. And at the same time, it would be undemocratic to prevent different factions from existing. Now, there's a little bit of context that we need to provide here, because even though Madison is saying this, he's saying this at a time when only 6% of the population could vote. So clearly when he's saying factions, he really is saying that when he wants to allow certain people to participate in this political system, this pluralist political system, he really is kind of implying that that should only be white men who are going to make up these factions. And so, partly because of the Federalist essays, the Federalists are better prepared. They had a better strategy, which was to target the smaller states first to try to build momentum to get these smaller states to ratify the Constitution. And their strategy works. And the ninth state ends up ratifying the Constitution on June 21st, 1788. That's New Hampshire. And that means that the Constitution goes into effect, even though the other 4 states hadn't ratified it. They eventually do because they don't want to be left out of the system. And part of this ratification does occur because the Federalists could only get across the finish line if they gave in to the Anti-Federalist demand to propose a Bill of Rights in the first Congress that would take place in 1789. And so Congress does propose 12 amendments, and 10 end up getting ratified by December 1791. And those 10 would be known as the Bill of Rights, which we'll talk a little bit more about when we get to the weekly module on civil liberties. We have now reached the end of the lecture on the Constitution. Go ahead and complete the discussion questions in Canvas, or make sure to come to the Zoom session for the in-person live discussion session.